Thank you to the organizers of the Secondhand Cultures and Practices Symposium for including my presentation, Sin Embargo, Te Quiero, and Yet I Love You, Economic Policy Encoded in the Consumption of Used Garments. This research comes from an ethnographic observation of the Clandestina brand undertaken in Havana, Cuba, and interviews with the founding partners. The article that this presentation comes from has just been published in Textile, Cloth, and Culture. I've put a link to the references that are on my website in the chat. Situated on a dusty side street in Cuba's Havana Vieja, there is an innovative and successful retailer that breaks many of the rules of modern fashion consumption. Namely, that a garment be fast to market, new, disposable, or that it be precious, fabricated from luxurious materials, and have high status and seductive advertising associated with it. Clandestina possesses none of these qualities. Founded by Idania del Rio on the left and Lairi Fernandez on the right in the photograph, their product line is made up of old t-shirts that have been donated from North America and are purchased cheaply through government-run stores. These are then recut and resewn into more stylish shapes and silkscreened with graphics that subvert the original messages of the t-shirts. Some of these are very funny, like the "Actually, I'm in Havana" silkscreened over the logos of North American teams or community groups, and Sin Embargo, Te Quiero, slyly referencing the American trade embargo in place since the revolution of 1959. They also create chic little shoppers from old grain and feed sacks. This use of secondhand goods is resourceful and, from a Cuban perspective, entirely practical, since local designers have been largely unable to access new imported materials since 1959. Instead, Clandestina takes a commodity that has been thoroughly devalued and, through their ingenuity and revolutionary vision, created a product far more valuable than the original constituent materials. The opportunity for this arose from the Cuenta Propista movement happening in Cuba, an economic project originally initiated by recently retired President Raul Castro. A Cuenta Propista is an entrepreneurial designation wherein a business can be operated within a trade sector, in this case, tailoring or dressmaking. This is one of their fashion shows at the boutique. They have referenced the ubiquitous laundry which is found hanging to dry from many Havana balconies. Everything the brand does is infused with a wry sense of humor and a proudly Habanera sensibility. This is my photo of the real thing. Lairi and Idania, a former UNESCO worker and graphic designer respectively, during our interviews revealed to me how they built their business from nothing. When we started this business, we talked to my mom and we said, we need to find a seamstress, somebody to help us. How to do this? And she said, well, remember Cornelia, your grandmother's friend? She's still living in Calle La Rosa, so you can talk to her. And by doing so, connected with elderly skilled seamstresses who work to reskill a new generation of Cuban fashion workers. The entrepreneurial duo also created one of Havana's hippest brands. Havana has a very vibrant DJ, music, and arts and culture scene, which Clandestina is integral to. The repurposed division of the brand is called Vintrash, combining vintage and trash in one hilarious brand identifier. This is not, however, the only instance of the revaluing of garments and fabrics historically. The consumption of secondhand goods during the 14th and 15th century in Renaissance Florence is detailed in Carol Collier Frick in the Florentine Regattieri, Secondhand Clothing Dealers and the Circulation of Goods in the Renaissance. In it, she characterizes Florence as a cloth town and states that textiles dominated the marketplace for urban goods, enabling the rise of an entire profession dedicated to servicing this market, the rigattieri. Even wealthy families had their clothing made from used cloth, fabricating new garments made with used cloth, panno usato, which people were always careful to distinguish from old or worn out cloth, panno vecchio or panno triste. The latter descriptor translates directly to sad cloth. Frick notes that in the Renaissance, good cloth and the clothing made from it retained its value for years, even decades, end quote. As such, their use and ownership was an aspect of communal family property and could be taken apart and sold as separate pieces. While Renaissance Florentine use and adoption of secondhand goods was entirely inwardly focused within the confines of the city itself, this was not true of British engagement with used clothing, which grew alongside the nascent colonialist economy of the British Empire. In her article, The Secondhand Clothing Trade in Europe and Beyond, Stages of Development and Enterprise in a Changing Material World, circa 1600 to 1850, Beverly Lemire examines the processes of consumption and redistribution of secondhand clothing in Britain and connects them with larger societal evolutions. Lemire identifies 3 stages of the evolution of secondhand clothing trade and states they are contiguous with expansion of international commerce, population growth, urbanization, and the birth of industrialization, end quote. During the first stage in the 1600s, cloth and clothing constituted 60 to 80% of all pawned goods in England. As pawning garments was a common method of accessing capital at this time, the scope of the economic engagement with clothing resale also encouraged the growth of a micro-enterprise vehicle and commercial venture for a new class of entrepreneurs. This new strata of economic activity constituted a hybridized commercial gray market of barter, pawn, and exchange, even recommodifying garments into alternative currencies. And it could be argued into a new form of soft currency that was external to the specific functionality of the garments tendered. In the second stage from the mid-18th century onwards, industrialization caused a greater volume of finished goods to enter the market, causing the secondhand trade to grow and also to metamorphosize. The respectable middle-class consumer of this time balked at the thought of garments with unknown provenance, instead turning to banks when loans were necessary rather than pawn garments to increase financial liquidity. Secondhand clothing then became identified as a working class practice. The third stage in this evolution involved, as Lemire states, cast-offs becoming a new charitable currency in the 1800s, linking households, institutions, colonial projects, and international trade, end quote. During this time, the reach of the charitable outputs grew to transglobal proportions. With the rise of empire, secondhand clothing expanded into ever wider commercial networks, increasing overseas markets for secondhand British garments. The colonial project of redistributing secondhand clothing globally can be clearly seen fully realized in the current manifestation of the transglobal distribution and consumption of secondhand garments. The majority of the secondhand commodity comes from donations in North America and Europe. I am, of course, not referring to beautiful vintage garments here, of which I am definitely a fan. I am referring to disposable, impossibly cheap goods, which were originally made for limited use. The ones sold through to intermediaries, who then redistribute them for profit in a pennies per pound wholesale transnational offloading. In Clothing Poverty, The Hidden World of Fast Fashion and Secondhand Clothes, David Brooks describes the process of secondhand dominance of the African market arising from domestic industries losing protection as a result of IMF and World Bank pressure to liberalize local economies. Brooks notes that due to the saturation of markets with cheap secondhand goods, the manufacturing of new garments becomes fundamentally unprofitable. As he states, while informal street traders may gain, simultaneously, the broader possibilities for the development of modern clothing industries are foreclosed, end quote. The end result is widespread deindustrialization and deskilling of the workforce, and an economy that is now dependent on a constant inflow of cheap secondhand commodities. This is not just damaging economically, it also causes cultural erosion as history and local traditions are drowned in a deluge of used goods. The creative industry of Clandestina thus has much to teach us about the potential for reuse of garments. Edward Said addresses the power inherent and available to be tapped as a part of counter-colonial actions within the cultural sector. As he speaks about those cast in the subordinate roles in larger, often brutal systems of global power. Those people, compelled by the system to play subordinate or imprisoning roles within it, emerge as conscious antagonists, disrupting it, proposing claims, advancing arguments that dispute the totalitarian compulsions of the world market. Clandestina does exactly this. They are the conscious antagonists who are subverting the asymmetries and globalized totalitarian compulsions, and do this through their counter-hegemonic cultural subterfuge of design. Through brilliantly capitalizing on the gross excesses of modern fashion capitalism, and through redesign, guided by what they categorize as a uniquely tropica style, they create value where previously there was none. In conclusion, Lairi and Idania have clearly inverted an entire system that is set up to exploit geopolitical inequalities, and one that assumes unreflective, unmitigated reception of a massive volume of secondhand goods. However, reuse and reappropriation need not be practiced only with what is basically a garbage commodity. As was seen in the Italian and British historical context, better constructed materials can make for easier reuse, which would curtail the excessive offloading of garments in the first place. Their home markets would actually want them. Clandestina has created a successful and disruptive business model in the context of the Cuban economy, but there is no reason why this recommoditization and revaluing could not be practiced without shipping used garments thousands of miles away. Indeed, this is already happening, as I explored in my article, Lux Perpetua, Future Pioneers Utilizing Historical Precedent as Design Innovation Within Fashion, published in Textile, Cloth, and Culture in 2019. This looked at the Eileen Fisher resewn operations, the division of the brand which remakes used garments into a fashion line of entirely new product. In Havana, the Clandestina brand takes advantage of wasteful, globalized fashion processes through recutting, reappropriating, and cleverly taking product that is one step away from the landfill and reinscribing it with value purely through their creativity. They did this originally by necessity, as there is precious little else to work with in Cuba. However, through this reappropriation and recapitalizing of garments at the very end of their consumer life cycle, they have created a new product that sells for a high price, as well as a business model that not only works, but is profitable as well. Vintrash shirts sell for approximately $20 US, which is far more than the original price that t-shirts would even have sold for brand new in North America. Clandestina has therefore taken a devalued commodity and created a fashion product far more valuable than even the original constituent materials. Clandestina has also created a product that is uniquely habanero, but ready to take on the world. The response of these young revolutionaries to the great global nowhere enacted by the massive dispersion of secondhand goods is a forthright, actually, I'm in Havana. Thank you again to the organizers. Thank you, Lairi and Idania of Clandestina. And also a special thank you, Dr. Hazel Clark and Dr. Alexander Palmer, whose Old Clothes, New Looks provided the foundation of much of this research.